Microphone check. I am back in the game. Sorry about the delusional perception of the fake people. My microphone cord was wrapped around this bracket and it was slowly cutting into the cord. I finally realized what the issue was, so I had to stop and put a doctor on the cord and fix the cord. You want to donate to a brand new studio, you could go to my Cash App, my PayPal or something. Just kidding. I know you guys ain't gonna fund no real shit. All right, let's get into this show. Here we're gonna listen to someone raised in African culture in Africa, went to college and got a proper education, and is on a doctorate level of his understanding in a proper fashion. And he realizes the fault of the African socialist, communist dictatorships that rule Africa and bring Africa's economy to its knees. So for all you fake Black power, Pan-Africanist Kemetic community in America, thinking you're going to go to Africa and invest your money, you're only going to over time realize that the government here is highly corrupted. And if you don't participate in the corruption, you shall have nothing. Now, with no further ado, let's get into it. And I want you to pay close attention.
In Africa. Let me give you a few statistics. 1985, for example, 2 million Africans perished needlessly from famine. Currently, Africa imports about 40% of its food. It used to be able to feed itself in the 1950s. Now, currently, more than 10 million African peasants have fled their countries. They are refugees. I'm not even counting those who are trapped in their own countries. You have civil wars. I call them senseless civil wars raging on in at least 15 African countries. In Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Sudan. Income per capita for many African countries today are much, much lower than what they were in the 1960s. Now, why did things go so wrong in Africa? If you ask the leaders and the elites of Africa or the intellectuals of Africa, they'll tell you that, it was the colonialists. It was American imperialism. It was the IMF. It was the International Monetary System, which was against Africa. For years and for decades, this is what we had. It got to a point where even the so-called backward and illiterate persons got fed up with it. And this is what they said. True. External factors have played a role in Africa's crisis. But by far, the most important factors were internal. It's now come to a time where Africa has to look at itself and the leaders have to look at themselves. Saying that the leaders have to look at themselves does not mean that you're holding grief for colonialism or for imperialism or for what. If you take, say, a cup, and the cup is full of holes, obviously that cup, common sense tells you that that cup is not going to hold water for a long time. No matter how much water you put in it, it's all going to drain away. And to the extent that you have internal leaks in Africa, this is very important, to the extent that you have internal leaks in Africa, no matter how much foreign aid you pour into the region, it's not gonna be of any use. What do? Again, common sense suggests that as the first order of priority, you should plug those leaks. And if you plug those leaks, then the little foreign exchange or foreign aid that comes in can stay. Now, what are the internal leaks? 1, incompetent leadership. 2, corruption. 3, misguided ideologies. 4, civil wars. Obviously, I cannot discuss all these internal factors. I like to pick one of them. And that one was the imposition of socialism in Africa. The socialism that we had in Africa was a very, very, very peculiar type of socialism. And this is how many African officials defined the socialism. There was one minister in Kwame Nkrumah's cabinet in Ghana. When asked to define socialism, he said, socialism does not mean if you have made a lot of money, you cannot keep it. There was also another minister in Mugabe's government. He was asked to define socialism. And he said, in Zimbabwe, socialism means that what is mine, but what is yours, we share. Now, this is the peculiar kind of socialism that was imposed on Africa. A peculiar type of socialism which allowed the head of state and the phalanx of kleptocrats to rape and plunder their state treasuries for deposit in Swiss bank accounts. Under Mobutuism, the president of Zaire, President Mobutu, has more than 8 billion Swiss bank accounts. Now, his personal fortune alone can pay off the entire foreign debt of his country. And when Africans were starving in 1985, Mobutu, who himself boasted on 60 Minutes, CBS, 60 Minutes, did not lift a finger to help his own fellow African people. Why did so many African governments or leaders choose socialism? The reason why they chose socialism was because they felt colonialism and capitalism were the same. In fact, Lenin said capitalism was the extension of colonialism and imperialism. So when we gained our independence, African leaders didn't want to have anything to do with capitalism. It was exploitative. We wanted socialism because socialism was what we needed to fight the imperialists. Now, this is what Nkrumah of Ghana said. And also, Nyerere of Tanzania said, well, capitalism encourages individual acquisitiveness and competition. We don't want that. We want social justice. So we want socialism. So a lot of African leaders adopted socialism as an ideology. And by that ideology, socialism meant state participation in the economy. As a matter of fact, Nkrumah of Ghana said that under socialism, state participation in the economy was to be taken to a point of complete ownership of the economy by the government. Very, very, very frightening. And accordingly, Nkrumah nationalized all foreign companies, set up state enterprises, imposed price controls, gagged the press. Anybody who spoke out against Nkrumah was locked up. At the time of independence, Ghana's per capita income was $200 per head. And Ghana also had a respectable foreign exchange reserves of 400 million. 3 years into Nkrumah's socialist experiment, Ghana was bankrupt and borrowing money. Now, when Nkrumah was overthrown in 1966, Ghana had a foreign debt of about $1 billion with nothing to show for. We had all these state enterprises, but they were so hopelessly inefficient that in 1983, for example, about 20% of those state enterprises were producing using 40% of their capacity, industrial capacity. The rest was just, making losses upon losses upon losses. We had, a Black Star Line shipping agency. And it had so much redundant staff that in 1984, about 284 of them were paid for 3 years to stay home. It was not only in Ghana that you had all these state enterprises, Tanzania, Somalia. Somalia, for example, under socialism, state enterprises, Somalia built a plant to box bananas. But the amount of bananas the plant needed to break even exceeded the entire national output of bananas. A lot of the industries that were acquired under state ownership and also under state socialism were so haphazardly acquired that they were inefficient and very, very poorly designed. Ghana also built a state sugar factory. It took 3 years to complete that factory in 1979. And when it was completed, that factory laid idle for a year because somebody forgot to install a water supply system. If you go to Tanzania, for example, if I could give you a few statistics, many of the state enterprises established under Nyerere have been so grossly bloated, and also many of them are simply just not paying their way. Besides state enterprises, African governments also set up state farms to produce food for their people. And the state farms that Ghana set up were so inefficient that it could not even produce enough food to feed its own workers, let alone the nation. Now, the same experience also occurred in Tanzania, where under what was known as Operation Dodoma, many persons were uprooted and forcibly settled under some village community programs, which Nyerere called Injama. After that experiment in 1973, between 1974 and 1975, agricultural production plummeted. Tanzania used to be able to feed itself, but by 1983, it was importing close to 1/3 of its food needs. There's no question, and I'm not going to bore you with giving you lots and lots of statistics. And there's no question that the socialist experiment in Africa was a complete failure. Why did it fail in Africa? There were 4 reasons. One, Socialism created a very huge and unwieldy state bureaucracy. And that bureaucracy was characterized by waste, inefficiency, and mismanagement. The second reason why socialism failed in Africa was because the ideology itself created a whole paraphernalia of controls and regulations. And this is important. The controls and regulations breed corruption. And the problem is, when corruption appeared in Africa because of controls, African governments wanted to correct the corruption. So they imposed more controls, as if more of the bad medicine will cure the patient. The third reason why socialism failed in Africa was because it resulted in an extreme concentration of powers in the hands of a tiny minority as the ruling elites. And this power in much of Africa was used to suppress, to say that power was abused, used to suppress the peasant majority. If you take a look at across Africa, there are two classes. You have the elite minority, and you have the peasant majority in almost every African country. The elite minority has concentrated all the power in itself and does not share power with the peasant majority. Now, there are 41 Black African countries, and only 2 of them allow the peasant majority the right to vote. Many of these African leaders calling upon South Africa to give Blacks the right to vote, which they should have, nobody questions that, themselves do not allow their own Black African people the right to choose and vote for their leaders. The fourth reason, and this is most important, why socialism failed in Africa is because the ideology itself is alien to indigenous African culture. Very important. That ideology is alien to indigenous African culture. In indigenous Africa, all the means of production, with the possible exception of land, is privately owned. The fishing canoes, the nets, the huts, the bows and arrows, they're owned by peasants. They're not owned by their chiefs. The peasants go about their economic activities on their own initiative, not at the behest of their chiefs. And when the peasants produce any surplus, they take these surpluses to village markets. And now these village markets have always been open and free. The chiefs do not impose price controls on their peasants. And when the peasants make any profit, it's theirs to keep, not for the chief to expropriate. There were free markets in Africa before the white man set foot on the continent. And there was free trade on the continent before the European colonialists arrived. Before the explorers arrived in Africa, there were free trade routes, crisscrossing. In fact, Africa was dense. There was a dense web of trade routes crisscrossing the continent. The most notable ones were those crossing the Sahara, and you have trans-Saharan trade. These trade routes were in existence as far back as the 9th century. Africa was quote unquote discovered in the 16th century. Along the southern termini of these free trade routes were such market towns as Timbuktu. Timbuktu was a great market town, free trade market town. And Kano in Salaga. There were also empires in Africa. There was the Mali Empire, there was the Ghana Empire, there was the Songhai Empire, and also the Great Zimbabwe Empire. Fortunes of these empires were built on free trade. This was what was there before Africa was colonized. The peasants are enterprising individuals, and they engage in trade and sell their produce on open free markets. In the traditional system, the chiefs do not operate state enterprises. In the traditional system, the chiefs also do not lock up dissidents. In the traditional system also, the chiefs do not impose foreign ideologies on their peasants or impose themselves on their peasants, nor does the chief declare himself president for life. The chiefs are appointed. They do not appoint themselves. That's the difference. And when a chief does not rule according to the will of the people, he is thrown out. In the indigenous system of government, there was participatory democracy. If you go to Ethiopia or Addis Ababa, you find the portraits of Marx and Lenin. It says a lot. And this is what it says. Now, here we are, Black Africans. In the 60s, we said we did not want the white colonialist. So we hauled down the portraits of the European monarchs. And in Ethiopia, we put up the portraits of another set of white aliens. The peasants look at this and they say that is basic stupidity 101. I'd like to stop here, and if you have any questions, you can ask. I have read this book, After Apartheid, The Solution. I think it is a very important step. As a matter of fact, I reviewed that book, and I could send people copies of the review if they are interested. What I like about that book is its emphasis on free markets, but there are a couple of things which I didn't like about the book, and what I didn't like about the book is that the model that he proposes for South Africa is the Swiss model. And in the book, he says that even the Swiss model is much more appropriate for South Africa than for Switzerland itself. I didn't think that was necessary. Because, you see, this is what we did after independence. When we gained our independence, we never sat down and used our brains to devise a system which is suitable to our own circumstances and conditions. We hopped from one foreign country to another and borrowed, copied foreign systems and planted them in Africa. They never worked. So when Leon Lau says that here is the Swiss model which is appropriate for South Africa, I sort of hesitate. We ought to be able to create our own system which will work in South Africa. And there's one thing which I like to put across to you, and that is, whatever system that is installed in South Africa, there's one condition which must be demanded, and that is anybody who runs for federal office in South Africa must win at least 20% of his vote from a race or a tribe other than his own. Think about it. If we had done this in independent Africa, and if you needed 10% of your vote from a tribe other than your own, we would have built bridges to the other tribes to try and win their votes instead of slaughtering them. Are there certain Western schools of choice for the sons that they'll need to go to The sons of the elites to go to school. Well, most of the socialists got their training from the West, from Harvard and from the London School of Economics and from the Sorbonne. Yes. Senegal and Botswana. Corruption. Pardon? Yes. Let's take Egypt, for example. Before you get a permit to build a house, you must go through 32 separate stages of, getting approval. I think we should scale back governments. Well, we had no chance. Most of the power was concentrated in the hands of just one individual. Take a look at Zimbabwe, for example. You can't criticize Mugabe. Here's a man who has set himself on a course of Marxist and Leninist path. Can't criticize him. Now, in all those African countries, there are 51 African countries, the freedom of expression exists in only 4 of them. 4, Botswana, Senegal, Mauritius, and possibly Nigeria. Kenya is beginning to unravel. Sad. I personally believe that the most effective aid that America can ever render for Africa is to help reinstitute Africa's own indigenous freedom of expression. Because there are many Africans like me who like to speak. And I can speak like this in Africa, there's no way. But I'd like to be able to speak like this in Africa. It's a combination of incompetence and corruption. It is almost everybody, and this is important. Almost everybody realizes that things have gone wrong. And almost everybody also realizes that Africa will be indispensable to the West. Africa is the source of many strategic minerals, gold, diamonds, cobalt, some oil, manganese, bauxite, vanadium, rhodium. So the West can't do without Africa. Africa is too vital for the West's economic security. But the place is racked up by, ravaged by a crisis. How do you solve it? 2 problems. 1, the causes of the crisis have been both external and internal. Most of the African leaders, of course, would like to say that would like to put all the blame on the external factors. They don't want to look at the internal factors. Now, if the internal factors are important, then obviously we have to devise internal solutions for them. But we can't, because the freedom for us to do so doesn't exist. So what happens? There's Americans and the IMF and the World Bank, which draws up solutions and give these solutions to African leaders. But that wouldn't work, because there's only so much Americans and the IMF can do in Africa without being accused of interfering in the domestic affairs of our sovereign African nations. So what do we have to do? The solution lies in telling the Africans, all right, if you don't like our solutions, well, draw one up yourself. The real solution is for the Africans themselves to come up with their own solutions, but they can't because of autocratic, leaders. Oh yes, you take a look at Zaire, for example. In Zaire, of every $1 that comes in as foreign aid, the officials take 20% off the top for their own personal cut. Foreign aid has, supported and has underwritten oppressive policies in Africa for a very, very, very long time. Take a look at Ethiopia, for example. What do you do in Ethiopia? Should Americans cut off foreign aid? Many would say, no, there are people starving in Ethiopia. We can't cut off foreign aid. We have to give them aid. We have to save the children. We have to save the Ethiopian people. But if you ship the foreign aid, where does that go? Mengistu insists that the foreign aid has to pass through the government. And in 1985, when millions of Ethiopians were starving, this man found a wherewithal to import $100 million worth of Scotch whiskey from London to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Soviet imperialism in Ethiopia. Nobody said anything.
Years ago, there was a book called Endless Enemies by Jonathan Flinty. He argued that it was in many parts of the world, Africa particularly. One of his chapters was on this idea. Do you think that there is an interest in American policies to actually maintain socialism in Africa, or do you think it's just an accident?
I think it was more of an accident. More of an accident because let me explain this. See, when we gained our independence and we wanted to develop, there were so many, let me use the word foreigners, who wanted to help us. Which road should we take? Should we take the capitalist road, or should we take the socialist road, or should we take what road? At that time, nobody had any idea of the psychological makeup of the African peasant, the majority of Africans. Nobody understood them. There were a lot of misconceptions and myths about this peasant. Nobody even knew that there were village markets in Africa. So we had planners who came to Africa and said, well, you can't rely on the market because the market doesn't function. You can't rely upon the market because the peasant doesn't respond to market incentives. What you got to do is to have the state plan this and plan that and plan that. So African governments drew up very ambitious development projects and plans, came to Washington, handed it over to the American government. American government said, yes, we're going to support you. Because you see, the American government itself didn't understand what was there. So what I'm saying is that if you want to help the peasants, common sense says that you got to understand those that you're going to help. And you got to understand their system. What is their system? Their system is a free market system. The peasants are free enterprises. What they grow on their plots of land are for their own individual decisions to make, not for the chief to dictate to them. That system, the indigenous system, came under unrelentless assault after independence by our own leaders. as recently as 1983, the government of Ghana was blowing up indigenous markets. Yes, and burning down indigenous markets. Why? Because the peasant food traders would not sell their produce at government dictated prices. And the government was locking them up. The government was locking up and throwing up these food producers in jail. In 1984, after so many of them had been thrown into jail, the government realized that it didn't have the food to feed them. Common sense. Of course, if you jail up all the food traders, where the hell are you going to get your food? 30 of them, by the way, died in prison.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the Camp Apple next door to where there was a sort of a charismatic socialist leader who was very anti-corruption, and he was working and executed into by a more free market-oriented person who seems to be a little bit more corrupt and more state enterprise. Comment on that.
Both of those regimes are military. And I personally do not go for military regimes in Africa because the military has been the scourge of Africa. If you take the African countries which are considered to be economically, the economic basket cases, Ethiopia, Angola, Ghana, Liberia, Nigeria, Zaire, Uganda, Somalia, all these are economic basket cases. They're all being ruled by military dictatorships. There's a correlation between military regimes and the economic performance. Soldiers do not know how to run economies. Even the soldiers, the military that we have in Africa, they can't even do battle with armed robbers in their own countries, let alone defend their countries. Ghana's derives about 65% of its foreign exchange earnings from cocoa. Now, cocoa is produced by individual peasant farmers. Now, listen to this. Individual peasant farmers can sell their cocoa to only one buyer, and that is the State Cocoa Marketing Board. Now, State Cocoa Marketing Board sets the price it's going to pay the producers. All right. So if you produce cocoa and you don't like the price that the state is paying you have very little choice. Now, the price that the government of Ghana pays the farmers is politically determined. It's not determined by market forces. In 1984, what the government was paying the farmers was about 20% of the world market price for cocoa. Of course, the peasants were no fools. They took their cocoa elsewhere where they could get a better price. They smuggled it, took their cocoa to Ivory Coast. Now, what did the government of Ghana do? The government of Ghana said, these smugglers are nation wreckers. They are economic saboteurs. If we catch the smugglers, we're going to shoot them by firing squad. 1985, the government of Ghana came to its senses and offered better prices to the farmers, and Cocoa Marketing Board was able to sell more cocoa to the world market. Yeah. Okay?
You had mentioned that the indigenous population was basically free market, and you support the free market. This is an if-then question. If the indigenous population had not supported the free market, and instead had supported some form of socialism, would you still believe in the idea of the free market? Would you still prefer the free market?
This is a philosophical question. I'm an economist, and I believe in the free market. I'm an economist and I believe in a free market system.
regardless of whether the indigenous population.
Yeah, but when we come to development, it happens that the indigenous people are free enterprises.
The reason I asked the question is you seem to indicate that earlier at a question about GMO that if an idea was not indigenous, that there was something wrong with bringing it into a system. And
No,
I guess I'm expressing an opinion. I'm trying to find out if an idea is good, does it matter where it comes from?
The thing is, you plant what is suitable to your own conditions. The fact that California grows apples does not mean that we should grow apples in Africa. The thing is, we have a system which is part of our culture. It wasn't perfect. Our responsibility was to take that system and build upon it and improve upon it. What the African leaders wanted to do was, what they did was they went to China and Russia and so many other countries and borrowed systems and planted them there. They were alien and they didn't survive. So we wasted a lot of money, time, energy, and so forth. So what I'm saying that, let's go to the indigenous system. What is there is free enterprise.
Thank you, Dr. Ivey.
All right, hold on and be strong, because when it's on, it's on. Okay, let me pause my video here. All right, so let me reiterate these points. So here we have an African, Black African economist. You now have to put Black on the words of the people of Africa, because the message is so convoluted. Now I have a lot of people tuning in. They've been enjoying these couple of days. I see some of my older followers. And here's the problem with the YouTubers. Here's why I do not pay attention to my followers. Because most of you got involved with YouTube for your own personal fame and gain of how many people are tuning into your channel. And that's cool. That is exactly what YouTube is for. But once you jump on a message and you get into the depth of what we were doing in the conscious community, if you started your YouTube channel after 2017, you were not spreading information. You was what we just called the opportunists who found out that you could go live on YouTube. Because the heartbeat of the information came from the people who studied the books before they went live, understood the arguments before they had debates. But then what the next generation of YouTubers did was opinion shows like CNN and MSNBC, where some of you who absorb all the nonsense really didn't have the dedicated time to understanding the arguments. And so when you came on to share the information, you propagated all the bullshit because you never understood the arguments from the beginning. And that's cool. It's okay to do what you want to do. It's your life and you got to live it. So when I show up, I play the enemy. Most of the time, the bad guy. On purpose. Because the level of damage that you're doing by either incompetence, negligence, or worst of all, intentional misguidance when you call yourself sharing knowledge. It slows yourself down and those listening to you down so much for so long that ignorance for Black people is going to be constant. Do you understand why Barack Obama made sure a Martin Luther King statue was erected in Washington, D.C. during his years in office? That was to reinforce the socialist communist view. This is why the right called Barack Obama the real Hitler, the guy who was really pushing socialism, Marxism, neo-nationalism, otherwise known as neo-Nazi, because the level of politics is about understanding the arguments so that you can understand the agendas. I know for facto, I'm way past you. Not because I'm better, because I'm well informed. And it really, 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 really is difficult to share this level of information with the uninformed. They don't want to hear it. It is too many mega platforms pushing the opposite. Let me go find this ridiculous ass Negro who has a PhD, player hater degree. I mean, my next step, I'm gonna have to tap into this particular. Where is this video at? Let's see. Oh, here we go. Michael Eric Dyson. He's one of the communists, the Black communist Satanists of the left. Their determination to push this agenda is so ridiculous.
Cole,
They know what they're doing. Hold on. Okay. So here's how profound, like all you YouTubers, you guys are like the babies of what he's about to say. You guys are pushing the same message. It's just you're not trained to do it. You're doing it through what they call the echo chamber, where the masters of social engineering set the pattern and throw it into the echo chamber. And you're somewhere down the chamber saying what you're hearing coming down the chamber. You don't know to whom it came from and to where it's going. You just said whatever you heard from down the street. Because it sounded good, because you couldn't put it in full context. And it just sounded good, so you yelled it out too. Somebody yelled, "Burn this motherfucker down." You yell, "Burn this motherfucker down." Because they angry and you angry, and that's how you feel. But you don't understand the context of why they telling you to burn it down. It just sounds good. And so you create the echo chamber. So here we have Eric Mike Dyson, the Mr. Dictionary, got beat up by Candace Owens, who was only red-pilled for 12 months. Knocked him out the park coming in the door. Some of y'all so uninformed that you focus on the wrong people to attack, because you're not really understanding why they're saying what they're saying at a particular time. And so you attack them because that's what the sleep do. They move off anger and frustration and misguidance. So a documentary was put out by the propaganda Democrat, leftist, socialist, communist, Leninist, Marxist regime. It's a long word, isn't it? It was called 1619. It's a pure propaganda, leftist propaganda, socialist engineered program. The counter to that, I played Bob Woodson, who countered it with his own documentary called 1776, both dealing with the same subject. One from the socialist perspective and the other from the free market libertarian perspective. Freedom. One for slavery, the other for freedom in simplicity. Now, what you just heard in the talk that I just shared is an economist in Africa explaining to you how the African governments, multiple governments, adopted socialism as the motto and destroyed the free market of what he called the peasantry, the poor who grew food in their front yard to sell at whatever prices they choose to sell it. And the dictatorship government represented by the Democrats in America today, represented by the independents in America today, represented by the rioters in America today. This is that group that we banging on, programmed by communist socialists, by the Communist Socialist Globalist Party, funded by George Soros. We could go on and on connecting all the dots. This video, 19,000 views, released January 1st, 2020. The host, a puppet, about to throw some softball questions to one of their own. They already know his view. They know exactly how he's going to answer it because he talks this talk all over YouTube. No black people really follow this guy. They think he's smart. They think he understands the entirety of a dictionary. He teaches at the socialist colleges. He socializes the next group of idiot black people whose parents sent you to college for a pre-programmed education in socialism so that you will never ever wake up and want to have free trade, the ability to control your own production. You want to join the assembly line and get your ration. So I'm going to let this kind of video play and then I'm going to analyze it. Should I analyze it as we go? Or do you think you can retain? Oh, wait a minute. Please, okay. Damn it. It did do it. Hold on. Let me go back.
These protests certainly aren't.
All right. I'm going to play it in a second. First, Tyson. That's the subject coming up. I play all these different things because, I'm trying to give you the side that's propagating the confusion while also giving you the side that's dissecting the confusion. And it always falls on these two sides: free trade and socialism. That's the dividing line. Everything fits. We can also iterate that as the Republic versus the Democrat Party. We can also slice that pie down the middle between socialism or capitalism. Another way to say socialism or capitalism is to say, do you want the government to control everything, or would you like individuals to control everything? Which one sounds like freedom? This is the dividing line. So here we got to play a little bit of the side that would like the government to control everything. Government control of the means of production is the standard textbook definition of socialism. It varies, it expands, it contracts. It is convoluted, it is wide, it is deep, it is swamp. Socialism is represented in words such as deep state. Deep state is socialism. Shadow government is socialism. The swamp is socialism. This is why you have to push Donald Trump. You don't have anything else fighting against socialism. You got to push everything that fights against socialism. But Black people have been pre-programmed since W.E.B. Du Bois marched Black people from the Republican Party into the Democrat Party in 1912. 108 years ago, you were tricked by an atheist, socialist, revolutionary spirit. And your life has been going downhill ever since. Racism is a double-speak word for socialism. It is their defense word. They use it to fight capitalism. Anytime they disagree with capitalism, racism will be instituted for those that they're speaking about. I know that y'all not going to really study the arguments. You're just going to wait for me to go live or somebody to go live, and you're going to get in the chat room and you want to be seen and you want to be heard and you want people to come listen to you. I get it. I get it. I get it. I get it. But you're not getting it. I mean, if you got a channel where, you sharing how to grow plants, we ain't tripping. We need that. If you're sharing your paintings and, your personal, what you're doing, we get it. We need that. But that's irrelevant to what I'm talking about. What you do. What you do is relevant if what you're doing is not breaking down the politics of what the hell is going on. Why are Black people frustrated? They're not out there rioting because they're frustrated. They're out there rioting because opportunity just presented itself. They don't need to wait for somebody to get stomped out by a police officer to go tear this motherfucker up. They just need everybody to come outside at the same time. But they're not tearing it up to change anything. They're tearing it up because they want some free shit. And that's it. They're more consumed in the rap game than they are what their future look like, what their freedoms look like. This is why all the rappers fight for socialism, because they already got the check. See, if you get to be among the presidential elite, you don't give a fuck what the peasants got to go through. You living good. You don't care. They told you, you and your children and your children's children will not suffer the fate that socialism has for the rest of the country. And you say, oh, well, in that case, fuck them. And you'll come out and be Mr. Killer Mike all goddamn day, crying on the mic, kill your master, dumbass, convoluted bullshit messages. Why the public, who barely got an education, 18 years old, just got out of high school, not sure what he want to do in life, mad because he feel like he been mistreated all his life, and he needs some direction. You think he gonna listen to Pit Boss with 200 views on his channel versus a rapper, one of his favorite rappers that pull up in the Bentley and leave in a helicopter? Hell no. He ain't got time. He want to get to the money. He don't want to get to freedom. He's ready to join the socialist propaganda if it means you're going to cut the check to him, because we all have that opportunist desire in us, where if I could benefit, fuck everybody else. That's what makes drug dealers sell drugs. It doesn't matter to them that they see crackheads walking around because of the drugs they sell. They don't give a shit. They're living good. They didn't tell anybody to smoke the crack. They feel like they're just supplying a need. And so it doesn't bother them. But you let white people come in there and want to hit you with a vaccine, and you're crying. Oh my God, Bill Gates is a racist. He wants to hit us with this vaccine, and you're crying. Well, you didn't cry when T.I. sold you drugs. You wasn't tripping when Killer Mike was selling you drugs, when David Banner was selling you drugs, when Sonetta was smoking drugs. You wasn't crying then. But as soon as these niggas turn around and put up that black socialist fist, you niggas start crying about racism, the injustice. And Pitbull just sit there and just shake my fucking head at, fuck you niggas so stupid. The dumb niggas just need to die so we can, the few little niggas left that got any kind of understanding, we can rebuild the nation with them. Because sometimes your mind could be so corrupted that to fix you is a worse problem. And sometimes you just got to let the dead die off and start anew with some fresh brains, uncorrupted. I know it's harsh. Ooh, I know Pit Boss is insensitive. I get it. But when you talk sensitive, you're going to sound like this guy I'm about to play, a very sensitive speaker. Now listen to the magical words and spells he casts.
First, this nation has seen over racism and police brutality in America, but they are...
Hold on, my computer loves the...
Georgetown professor Michael Eric Dyson. Michael, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Great to be here.
So what we're all witnessing right now is tantamount to the level of unrest when Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. Why do you think that this specific incident, George Floyd's death, was such a tipping point?
Well,
now hold up, because if she would ask me that, why is it such a tipping point? I would have immediately started talking about Anarchy USA documentary, and that the communists have deployed their 5 stages of propaganda upon us. And this is the result of the communist Republican Party programming. The Communist Republic, that's different than the Republic Party as far as ideology. Sounds the same, but it's different. But he's not going to tell you nothing about communism. He's not going to talk about Zionism. None of that. He's about to use spells to confound you.
Black people looked at him and said, that could have been me. They were easily identifying with him. A knee on the neck is metaphoric for the knee that white America has too often had on the necks of Black people. And begging for his mother, how intimate is that for Black people? That struck a nerve in Black America in a way that has unleashed tons of fury that have been compressed over the years. It was just enough. It was a tipping point that sent Black people over the edges, and it continues to unfold in the streets of America even today.
I just want to acknowledge we have a little bit of breakup on the line with you, but this is an important conversation to have, so we want to continue it. In your 2017 book, The Tears We Cannot Stop, you wrote that white people should participate in marches, rallies, and community meetings to engage in the struggle for racial justice. And I was thinking about it in terms of the coronavirus. You know, people are quick to say we're all in this together, but when it comes to racial inequality, that kind of mantra doesn't seem to resonate in quite the same way. What does it take to get people who don't see themselves as stakeholders in this movement of racial equality to put some skin in the game, so to speak?
Yeah, well, some skin in the game is exactly what we need. But the moment it was announced that this was a Black disease, that it was disproportionately affecting African-American people, you saw the rise of a kind of white intolerance and impatience that led them armed to storm the state houses and capitals of this nation, insisting that it was wrong to keep them held back. So there was no sense of partnership. There was no sense of common stakeholding. There was no sense of citizenship, e pluribus unum out of many one. And what we have to understand is that if they don't see that in regard to a pandemic like COVID-19, they're not going to see it in terms of a pandemic like COVID-16-19, like the racial fury that has been unleashed on this country 400 and some years ago.
Okay, right there, his COVID-16-19 was his plug to the socialist propaganda machine that has been created. I may have to go get the Bob Woodson video where he debunks this 1619 so he could explain it to you. But he's bringing in that propaganda that the left does. These are their speakers. This is Snoop Dogg with an education. This is T.I. with an education. This is Killer Mike with an education.
And so what we have to say is that America must deal with its racist past that continues to infect and affect its racist present. And people of goodwill who are white have to speak up. I'm convinced there are many more people of goodwill than bad, but they are not as vociferous and as loud and as vocal as those who repudiate the claims of civic democracy for African-American people. And until white people can join in fully, now we see some of that on the streets, but we don't need that kind of allyship where, you know, white folk are breaking into stores and stuff, and then Black people still bear the burden because of disproportionate concentration on African-American criminals. What we need is white people to riot at work. Do it with the CEOs of companies. Do it with, you know, your institutions of American society, the redistribution of wealth. Do it with the kinds of educational opportunities that should occur. So there are ways in which white allies can open up spaces and open up doors that permit African-American people to flourish. That's the kind of stakeholding we'll need if this thing is to turn around. And
COVID-16-19 is very clever, and for the aware, obviously giving a nod to 401 years ago when the first slave ship came ashore to this country. In an essay posted on Medium today, former President Barack Obama said the more specific we can make demands for criminal justice and police reform, the harder it will be for elected officials to just offer lip service to the cause. What actionable demands can protesters be making of their elected officials? I mean, give us a top three list.
Deal with criminal justice reform, talk about prosecutors who must be held to account when it comes to holding the police to account. Too often the police and prosecutors are working together, they're in bed with each other. And
okay, now hold up. Because George Soros is propagating the same message that he's propagating, but George Soros funded prosecutors around the country. And his design was to start letting these people go. We seen that when we seen the Smollett case, where he faked like two white men in a great Make America Great hat, put a noose around his neck. And then when that prosecutor came in George Soros gave her $400,000 for her campaign to seat her in that seat, along with many more across the country. Now, the same side of the team wants to tell us that's the problem. I mean, it's so slick. This shit is so slick that if you don't got a proper education and understanding and a critical mind, you will not be able to analyze what's going on. These people are using spells, satanic rituals to entrap you in their snares. Let's let it keep riding.
That is the prosecutor is loath to hold the other, that is the police person, accountable. Number two, we need to have community policing. We need to have oversight of policing as well. It's a two-pronged thing. And thirdly, we've got to figure out the division of labor. Police people should not be sent to handle, I don't know, mentally ill people that they end up killing, especially when they're African American. We've got to find a way in which to defund certain police departments and then put the cash toward those areas of social service that are devoted to helping people who are vulnerable instead of being treated to the police. Turn to our African American and Latinx brothers and sisters who are of the cloth, so to speak, of the badge and the baton, and find out from them how to handle these matters. Many more things to be done, but that's the list I'd begin with.
And just one more, because you kind of touched on this a little bit. This started out as a George Floyd issue. That was the lighter fluid, if you will. But let's talk about what was already smoldering beneath the surface. Some say for decades, but I think it's probably safe to say for centuries, and the broader implications for this now. Because even if those 3 officers are arrested at this point, does that stop the protest, or has this now widened out to be more than just criminal justice, but about systemic racism?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right in your eloquent summary there. It is about systemic racism. It's about structural inequalities, the things that are deeply entrenched into the system itself. You don't have to have anybody standing over you. You don't have to have a white intending person or an intentional racism operating there. It's a kind of deus ex machina, a ghost in the machine. And the ghost of the machine, in this case, is bigotry and prejudice and violence toward African American people. But it doesn't have to be an individual desire expressed. It is the system itself producing inequality. And as a result of that, these structural and systemic features suggest that this protest now is not simply about the death of George Floyd. It's about the death of American democracy, decency, and humanity. And it's about the way in which Black people continue to be the victims of thuggishness from an American president and from a government that is grossly insensitive and not empathetic at all to our plight and our predicament.
Michael Eric Dyson, always a pleasure to talk.
Now, he put the blame on the American president to misguide you, because he doesn't want to talk about what the socialist communist view produces for Black people for well over 100 years, for well over. So now we're going to contrast that view, that clever 1619 perspective. We're going to contrast that.
The soap you shower with? Because I'll let you in on a little industry.
They spend a lot of money.
Today we're talking to Bob Woodson.
This is Bob Woodson, who put out the contrast to the 1619 propaganda documentary.
Then about his 1776 initiative and the New York Times 1619 project. I'm going to let Bob introduce himself because he has a very interesting background. So first, I'd like to talk about what makes you qualified to combat this controversial 1619 project.
I guess one qualification, since they're dealing with race, I'm a veteran of the civil rights movement, having led demonstrations in the hometown of a prominent civil rights leader, Westchester, Pennsylvania, Barrett Rustin. And so, so I've gone to jail, done all of the civil rights thing, and I left the movement on the issues of forced busing for integration and race-based affirmative action. And I have spent the last 40 plus years working on behalf of empowering low-income people of all races. So my interest in challenging what they're doing is because of the detrimental effect it's going to have on very vulnerable people living in these low-income neighborhoods, black, white, brown.
So the 1619 Project, for those of you that don't know, is aimed to reframe America's history. And it was produced by the New York Times in August of 2019, I believe. And its big thing is that American independence was based on keeping slavery.
Right. Protecting slavery.
Protecting slavery. So what do you have to say about that, given your extensive history in the civil rights movement?
Well, first of all, historians, of course, across the ideological spectrum have challenged them on the facts that America is not a slaveocracy, that we didn't fight the Revolutionary War to protect slavery. That is just a patent lie. But we also challenge its conclusion, and that is that the Declaration of Independence, because it was written by people who were slave owners, the ideals that they articulate therefore in that document are therefore invalid. That's the premise. And so there really is an attack on the whole character of the nation, saying that America's racism is in its DNA, which means it can't be changed. And that the problems and challenges facing large swaths of the Black community, such as out of wedlock birth, drug addiction, and violence, Black on Black violence, is associated with that legacy, the legacy of slavery and discrimination. And we think that that's really diabolical, and it's harmful to millions of Black people who are struggling, looking for solutions. But when you say to a group of people that you don't have the agency, or you don't have the ability to be agents of your own improvement, that's devastating. And so that's what we are challenging, that premise. We think it's disabling, it's dangerous for this nation to grow up divided. While 1619 says that all whites are complicit in white supremacy, and that all Blacks are the victims.
So you talked briefly about how this project sort of makes low-income Black communities feel like they have a crutch.
Yes,
so to speak.
It's disabling.
And so how do you, talk about your history. I know the Woodson Center. What makes you qualified to speak about the fact that these kids are now using this 1619 project to, kind of have an excuse to fail?
Over the past 38 years, the Woodson Center has worked in and on behalf of low-income, crime-ridden, drug-infested neighborhoods. We have demonstrated that when you go into these communities and you identify healing agents, people, indigenous leaders that share the same zip code as people experiencing the problems, they are the social entrepreneurs. They are the Josephs, if you will. So we've demonstrated that when you go in, and you go in with the expectation that people have the ability to solve their own problems, and then you provide them with the opportunity and the means, the money, the training it takes. And then we have seen dramatic changes from within those communities all over the nation. Violence in Washington, D.C., in an area where there was 53 murders in a 5 square block area in 2 years, by mobilizing healing agents, grassroots leaders from that community to address it, we went down to 0 deaths for 12 years. And so we have demonstrated, when you take the principles of the founders of self-discipline, of personal responsibility, when you take those values articulated by the founders, and you actually seek out people whose lives are the embodiment of those principles, provide them with the material means to nation all over the country.
So you talked about how many sort of low-income communities you've been able to build up over the years with the Woodson Center. The 1619 project is, as you know, being implemented in public schools around the country. If this continues, how do you expect it to affect these communities that you're trying to help in, say, 10, 20 years?
Okay, if we have thousands of low-income grassroots leaders who are saying to troubled young people in these communities, we are living examples or witnesses that transformation and redemption is possible. We escaped drugs and predatory behavior, so we are models and examples of what you can emulate. Well, if you got 16, 19 telling them what we are saying is not true, that if you are committing crimes against your own people, and if you are indulging in self-destructive behavior, don't listen to them, that you can't improve yourself. And so the answer, what is their answer? They don't have one. They just say reparations. Well, that's not an answer. And that's what's really dangerous, because 1619 is not offering any solutions. Those of us in 1776, we are offering solutions based upon what Blacks were able to do 100 years ago in response to oppression, and what Blacks are able to do today to carry on that tradition of self-help, self-development, and self-empowerment.
Do you believe in the core idea of the 1619 Project, that America's independence was founded to protect slavery?
Absolutely not. It's just not true. No one, if you say slaves are a commodity, an economic entity, what group of people would sacrifice their honor, their homes, their families to protect a commodity? Obviously, there are values that transcend material. That's why people, if you're having to run into a home to save a bag full of $50,000 versus taking a chance to rescue a child.
Yeah, which one are you going to choose?
Which one are you going to choose?
Should you choose?
Could you do both with the same amount of passion?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes it so ridiculous. No one would make those kind of sacrifices to protect a commodity.
Yeah. And so you, before we started this interview, you mentioned that you might be speaking with the lead writer, Nicole Hannah-Jones. I'm wondering, do you consider her a scholar? How do you think she's qualified to report on the 1619 Project?
Well, I don't question anyone's qualifications. I mean, good sense can come from unqualified people. Mm-hmm. But I just want to know, anxious to know the substance of what she's saying. I want to deal with the content. I just want to understand how she could be responsible for this propaganda. It's propaganda. It is not education. It's indoctrination. And I think she should be held accountable to explain why she chose to infect this community with these untruths and this message of self-devaluation.
She hasn't. So,
woo! See, what you need to do is go watch 1619 and then go watch 1776 by Bob Woodson, so you could see that propaganda versus that truth telling. This is how much they want you to remain suffering, that they will create full documentaries and bring out the elites to tell you how great it is, how great your suffering is, and how you do not hold the power to change it. That the power is in the hands of the racists if they would only stop being racist. Only if white people choose to stop being racist can you have an opportunity. This is what they're telling you. Because as long as a white man chooses to be racist, you cannot have an opportunity, because you do not control the means that operate your community. This is what they're telling you. That is hopeless. Do you think among whites, those that are racist will ever stop being racist? That will always be. Just like among blacks, there'll always be that dumb nigga. Forever. But does that mean because they live amongst you that the totality of the people cannot prosper? I'm so sick of this shit. I'm so sick of coming on here having to reiterate this shit over and over. The people that need to agree with me and pump this message will not do it because they are conscious, because they are woke, and they're not going to do it. They call themselves gods, and they are not going to do it. They don't want this shit to get to the masses. It'll destroy what they've been working on all their wokeness lives. So, that's all I got for you.